For most of my life, I believed we were a perfectly normal family. We lived in a tall, narrow house on Clement Street, right in the middle of the city. Our block was loud and busy. Taxis honked every morning. Neighbors sat on front steps and argued about football. Children ran through open fire hydrants every summer. It was messy and full of life, and I loved every part of it. My name is Zara. I am the youngest of 3 children. My brothers, Aaron and Nate, are 5 and 8 years older than me. Aaron was the quiet one, always thinking. Nate was warm and funny, always making me laugh. Mom's name was Pauline. She worked long nursing shifts and came home smelling like hospital soap and tiredness. Dad's name was Victor. He drove a city bus and spent days off watching football and fixing things around the house that were not actually broken. We were not rich, but we were not struggling either. And growing up, that felt like enough. I believed in our family the way children believe in the sky above them.
Completely.
Without question. Without ever once thinking to look for the cracks. I was 7 years old when I first noticed the arguments. Not small ones. Every family had those. I mean the big arguments. The ones that started in the kitchen and spread through the whole house like smoke through a closed room. Aaron and Nate were teenagers by then. Something had shifted in the way they talked to my parents, or maybe in the way my parents talked to them. The house felt tighter. Like everyone was holding their breath. I remember lying in bed at night, face pressed into my pillow, listening to voices coming through the wall. I could never make out the exact words. Just the tone. Sharp. Cold. Final. In the mornings, everything looked normal again. Dad poured his coffee. Mom packed lunches. Aaron and Nate ate in silence and left for school without saying much. I would sit at the table eating my cereal, watching all of them, sensing something I could not name. I was too young to understand it, but I remember a strange feeling in my chest, like standing at the edge of something deep and dark that I could not see the bottom of. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself all families were like this. I believed that completely, because believing it was so much easier than the alternative. There is one memory I have never been able to shake. I was 8 years old. A cold Saturday in November. The house heating was broken, so Mom had put extra blankets on all the beds. I was on the living room floor doing a puzzle when I heard Nate in the hallway. He was asking Dad if he could go to his friend Marcus's birthday party that evening. His voice was careful and polite. The kind of voice you use when you already know the answer might be no. Dad did not look up from the television. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Nate stood still. "But I finished all my homework. I've been." I said no. Nate walked away quietly. But later that night I heard him crying in his room. And that was the strange part. Nate never cried. Nate was the one who always laughed. Hearing him cry felt wrong in a way I could not explain. Like a sound that did not belong in the world I thought I lived in. I told myself he was just upset. I went back to my puzzle and I forgot about it. Or at least, I believed I had forgotten about it. But the truth is some things do not disappear just because you stop looking at them. They wait. Aaron left first. He was 18, fresh out of high school, when he told our parents he was moving in with a college friend across the city. I stood in the hallway watching him carry boxes to a borrowed car. He did not say much. He hugged me for a long time. Long enough that I started to feel scared without knowing why. Mom stood by the front door with her arms folded. Her face was the kind of blank that takes effort to maintain. Dad was nowhere to be seen. He had gone upstairs before Aaron even started packing and did not come back down until the car was gone. That evening at dinner, nobody mentioned Aaron. Mom served rice and chicken and asked about my school project. Dad ate quietly and returned to the television. It was as if Aaron had simply stopped existing. As if the chair he used to sit in had always been empty. I was 11 years old, and I missed my brother immediately. But what frightened me more was the silence. Nobody seemed sad. It felt less like a sun moving out and more like a problem that had quietly resolved itself. I did not understand that feeling for a long time, but I never forgot it either. Some things stay lodged inside you whether you want them to or not. Nate lasted 2 more years before he left too. By the time I was 13, I was old enough to notice more. I noticed that Nate and my father barely spoke. I noticed Mom always looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her job. I noticed that when Nate came home, even 20 minutes late, an argument would follow that lasted for hours. The night before Nate moved out, he sat on the edge of my bed and talked to me for a long time. He had found a small apartment with 2 roommates. He had saved enough from his part-time job to cover 3 months of rent. He said he was going to be fine. But then he paused and looked at me strangely. "You're going to be okay here," he said. "They're different with you." I asked what he meant. He shook his head and said quietly, "You'll understand one day." He hugged me and told me he loved me. And the next morning he was gone, just like Aaron. The house returned to its quiet rhythm as if nothing important had shifted. Mom cooked dinner. Dad watched television. I sat at the table and tried to figure out why the room felt so much smaller with just the 3 of us in it. I could not find the answer. Not yet. After both brothers left, the house changed again. This time, it changed for the better. Or so I believed. My parents seemed calmer. There were fewer raised voices. Mom sat with me while I did homework. Dad occasionally asked about my day and actually listened. On weekends, the 3 of us went to the park near the waterfront and ate hot dogs from the cart by the fountain. It was not perfect. My father was still quiet and distant much of the time. My mother still wore that permanent tiredness in her eyes. But there were no more late-night arguments. No more doors slamming. No more crying through walls. I was happy. And because I was happy, I did not question anything. I told myself my parents had simply grown, that families went through rough patches and came out softer on the other side. I told myself the tension I had watched as a young child was just a normal part of raising teenagers. I held on to that story, like a warm coat in winter. It felt true. It felt right. It felt like the only version of events that made sense. And not once did I stop to wonder whether my happiness had been purchased somewhere. Whether someone else had already paid the price so that by the time it reached me, it arrived looking like a gift. I was a good student. Not brilliant, but steady and hardworking. The kind who stayed after class to ask questions and always handed things in on time. My parents were proud of that. Mom framed my certificates and hung them in the hallway. Dad told the neighbors about my grades with a smile I rarely saw him use for anything else. My school friend Brianna once told me I was lucky. "Your parents actually show up," she said, picking at her lunch. "Mine forget what grade I'm in half the time." I laughed and agreed with her. Because compared to what she described, I did feel lucky. My parents were present. They pushed me gently and caught me carefully when I stumbled. But there was a quiet corner of my mind where another thought lived. A thought I never said out loud because it felt disloyal. That thought was this: where had all this attention been when Aaron and Nate were my age? Why had I never heard my father brag about their grades? Why had I never seen my mother frame a certificate for either of them? I pushed that thought down every time it surfaced. I told myself every child experienced family differently. I told myself there was nothing unusual about any of it. But the thought kept returning, quiet and persistent, like a knock at a door I was not ready to open. I was 16 when I first visited Aaron's apartment. He had moved twice by then and was living near the train station on the north side of the city. Small but tidy. A kitchen that smelled like coffee and old books. He seemed settled. Happy in the contained way that Aaron was always happy, as if contentment were something private that did not need to fill a room. We sat at his small table and ate pizza and talked for hours. He asked about school. I asked about his job. He worked at a printing company and was saving to go back to college. He was proud of that in the quiet way he was proud of everything. Toward the end of the evening, I asked him something I had been building up to for years. "Do you miss home?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I miss you." "But not the house?" He picked up his coffee cup and turned it slowly in his hands. "Zara," he said carefully, "some places aren't really homes for everyone inside them." I did not ask him to explain. I was not ready to hear the full answer. But I tucked his words somewhere deep inside me, in that quiet corner where all the other unanswered questions lived, growing heavier every year. Something was waiting to be said. I could feel it pressing against the inside of every conversation we had ever had. My Uncle Theo came to visit one autumn when I was 17. He was my father's younger brother, a big man with a loud laugh who worked on cargo ships and visited only a few times a year. He always brought gifts from distant places and smelled faintly of the sea, even in the middle of a landlocked city. That visit, he and Dad sat on the back porch for most of the evening, talking in low voices while I helped Mom clean up. At one point, I stepped outside to offer more drinks and caught the end of something Uncle Theo was saying. "Same thing you did with the older two, Victor. You know that's not right." Dad's voice was flat and hard. "This is my house, Theo. That doesn't make it right." There was a long silence. Then Dad noticed me in the doorway, and his expression closed like a shutter coming down. "Thank you, Zara," he said calmly. "We're fine." Uncle Theo looked at me. His eyes held something I could not name. Not pity exactly. Something older and sadder than pity. I went back inside and stood in the kitchen with my heart beating strangely. Something important had just happened, and I had only caught the edge of it. But even the edge was enough to change the texture of everything around me. The house felt different that night. Smaller somehow. And much less safe. I called Nate that same night from my bedroom. It was past midnight. He picked up after 2 rings, which told me he had not been sleeping either. "You okay?" he said. I told him exactly what I had overheard. I kept my voice low, even though my parents were at the other end of the house. I repeated Uncle Theo's words carefully. The silence that had followed. The way Dad's face had closed when he saw me standing there. Nate was quiet for a long time. "What did he mean?" I asked. "The same thing Dad did with you and Aaron." "What does that mean?" More silence. "Nate, please." He exhaled. "This is a conversation we need to have in person, not over the phone. Just tell me. Because some things, once you hear them, you can't unhear them. And I need to know you're ready before we go there." "I'm 17, I said. "I'm ready." He was quiet again for so long I thought he had changed his mind. Then he said, "Come and see me. Bring Aaron. We'll all talk together." He hung up, and I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. Sleep did not come. The words he had used sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Once you hear them, you can't unhear them. I repeated them to myself over and over until morning came pale and gray through the curtains. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, I took the train to Nate's apartment. Aaron was already there when I arrived. He was sitting in the living room with a mug of tea, looking calm and serious. Nate was in the kitchen. The apartment was warm and the city hummed outside, and everything looked ordinary and fine. But the air felt like the moment before something begins. We sat together in a triangle of mismatched chairs. Nate handed out the tea. Nobody spoke at first. I looked at Aaron, and he looked back at me with that steady, careful expression he used when he was choosing his words with precision. "You said you overheard Uncle Theo," Aaron said finally. "Yes. And you want to understand what he meant." "I've wanted to understand for years," I said. "I just didn't know there was anything to understand." Aaron looked at Nate. Nate looked at his mug. Then Nate looked up at me, and the familiar warmth in his face was still there, but quieter than usual. More careful. "Okay," he said softly. "We're going to tell you everything. But Zara, I need you to hear all of it before you react. All of it." "I will," I said. My hands were cold around the mug. Nate took a long, slow breath. And then he began to speak. And the story he told me was not the story I had been living inside my whole life. "Dad was different when we were growing up," Nate said. "Different how?" I asked. "Hard," said Aaron. The single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nate nodded slowly. "You know how he is now. Quiet, mostly calm, not very warm. But when we were kids, before you were old enough to notice, it was much worse than that." He described rules that seemed impossible to follow. Punishments handed out not for anything they had done, but for things Dad had decided they were guilty of based on nothing either of them could ever work out. "He would ground me for weeks," Nate said. "Not for breaking a rule. just because he was angry about something and I happened to be nearby. Aaron added quietly, he once made me sit at the dinner table for 4 hours because he said I had looked at him the wrong way. I stared at him. 4 hours. 4 hours. I was 12 years old. I tried to match this with the father I knew. The man who fixed things on weekends. The man who clapped at my school concerts. The shapes did not fit. But looking at my brothers' faces, sitting in that quiet room, I did not doubt a single word they were saying. Some truths you recognize immediately, even when they are completely new to you. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. You were a child, Aaron said. I've been asking questions for years. In small ways. We know, Nate said. We saw it. But Zara, you were living a good life. What purpose would it have served to take that from you? The truth has a purpose, I said. Even when it hurts. You're right, Nate said. It does. Aaron looked at me steadily. We were also protecting ourselves, he said honestly. Saying it out loud to you made it more real. And we had both spent years trying to make it less real. That honesty struck me harder than any anger would have. I had expected to feel slightly betrayed by years of silence. Instead, I felt something more uncomfortable. I felt how much it had cost them to carry this alone, for so long, without ever laying it down. I understood, sitting there in that small warm room, that my brothers had not kept this secret to hide something from me. They had kept it to protect the version of me that got to grow up untouched. They had shielded me not out of dishonesty, but out of a love so quiet and so expensive that I had not even known it was being spent on my behalf. The tenderness of that realization was almost unbearable. I cried for the first time that afternoon. Not dramatically. It started as a tightness in my throat. Then it became something I could no longer swallow down. I sat in Nate's mismatched chair with tears running down my face and nothing useful to say. Nate moved his chair beside mine and put his arm around my shoulders without a word. Aaron reached across and held my hand. The three of us sat like that in the middle of the city, in a small apartment smelling of tea and old carpet, and I cried for my brothers in a way I should have been able to cry years ago, if only I had known there was something to cry about. I cried for the birthday party Nate never got to go to. For Aaron sitting alone at a dinner table for 4 hours at 12 years old, for nothing. For every argument I had heard through a wall and dismissed. For every morning I had eaten cereal and watched two boys quietly surviving something I had no idea was happening right beside me. And I cried for myself too. Not out of self-pity, but because of the loss of a story I had been telling myself my whole life. A story that had been completely true for me and completely false at the same time. Both things at once, without contradiction. And now I had to figure out how to live in the space between them. Eventually the crying stopped, and we talked for a long time more. I asked questions I had been carrying for years without knowing they were questions. Why had Aaron left so quickly after high school? Because staying had become impossible. Why had Nate seemed so sad for much of his teenage years? Because he had been told in 100 quiet ways that his presence in the house was a problem to be managed rather than a life to be celebrated. I asked about specific memories. A summer when my parents had taken only me to visit relatives upstate, leaving Aaron and Nate with a neighbor for the weekend. I had thought nothing of it at the time. They said we had exams, Nate said. Did you? He smiled.
No.
I asked about Mrs. Owusu, our neighbor 3 houses down, who had sometimes given my brothers dinner when things at home were bad. I had always thought they went there because she cooked better than Mom. She did make better jollof rice, Nate said, and we all laughed at that. A real laugh. The kind that lives right next to heartbreak and does not pretend to be larger than it is. Mrs. Owusu had known. She had seen what was happening. And she had done the quiet thing that kind people do when they cannot fix something broken. She had simply made sure 2 boys had somewhere warm to eat. Sometimes that is all the help the world can offer. And sometimes it is enough. I went home that evening on the train. The city moved past the window in the dark. Apartment lights and restaurant signs and small corner shops all blurred together, soft and slightly out of focus. I sat with my forehead against the cold glass and tried to hold everything I had learned without letting any of it slip. Mom was in the living room when I got back. She was watching a documentary with the sound turned low, wrapped in her blue blanket. She looked up when I came through the door. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay," I said. She patted the cushion beside her. "Sit. I'll make you something." She went to the kitchen and came back with warm milk and honey. The same thing she had made for me when I was sick as a small child. She handed it to me and sat back down, and we watched television together in silence. And I thought, this woman loves me. I have never doubted that for a single day. That love has always been real. But sitting there holding the warm cup, I thought about Aaron at 12, sitting alone at a table for 4 hours for nothing. I thought about Nate crying quietly in his room. And the love I felt in that moment became more complicated than it had ever been before. Not less real, just larger, more expensive, full of questions I would need a long, slow time to work through. The weeks after that conversation were difficult in ways I had not anticipated. I went to school. I came home. I ate dinner with my parents and talked about ordinary things. But everything had a second layer now. A shadow version of itself running just beneath the surface. I watched my father more carefully. He was not a monster. I want to be honest about that because the truth is almost harder when the person is not a monster. He was a man who had carried his own wounds in the wrong direction, outward instead of inward, toward the people who lived closest to him. He had hurt my brothers not out of hatred, but because he had never learned what to do with the heaviness he carried inside. That did not make it right. But it made it human in a way that was harder to stay angry about. I watched my mother too. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, managing everything she could reach. She had always struck me as a woman who coped rather than thrived. Now I understood that coping had been a daily choice. And it had come with costs she never spoke about, costs my brothers had paid on her behalf without ever being asked or thanked. I was not ready to be angry at anyone yet. What I felt instead was a long, low grief. The grief of understanding that people who love you can also fail you. And that both of those things can be true at the exact same time. 3 months after the conversation at Nate's apartment, I asked my mother something. We were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. Dad had gone out early to help Uncle Theo move furniture. The house was quiet. I poured 2 coffees, set one in front of her, and sat down. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you something and I need an honest answer." She looked at me over her cup. Her eyes were steady, but something behind them shifted. The look of a person bracing for something they had been expecting for a long time. "Was it different?" I asked. "The way you and Dad were with Aaron and Nate when they were young? Compared to how you've been with me?" The longest silence I have ever sat inside followed that question. Then my mother put down her cup. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at them for a moment, and when she looked back up, her eyes were full in a way I had never seen. Not crying, just completely full, like a glass filled right up to the very edge, trembling. "Yes," she said. Just that. One word. Small and final and devastating. I nodded. I did not speak for a moment. Because sometimes the truth you have been chasing arrives far more quietly than you expected. And all you can do is sit with it, and breathe, and let it settle into the shape of your life. After that morning, something shifted between my mother and me. We did not become strangers. There were no slammed doors or words said in anger that could not be taken back. What happened was more subtle, and in some ways more painful. We became more honest. And honesty, after a lifetime of comfortable half-truths, is sharp in the beginning. She told me things over the following weeks in small pieces. Never all at once. She told me the early years of their marriage had been very hard. That my father had struggled with things he could never fully name and had never looked for help with. That she had tried to manage him, to smooth the rough edges of his moods. That she had not always managed it well, and that her sons had paid the price for the times she failed. She told me the change in my father when I was born had been real, that he had held me in the hospital and wept in a way she had never seen him weep, that something had cracked open in him that day, and that she had felt relieved and grateful and also deeply sad, because she knew what it meant. It meant the capacity had always existed in him. It had simply not been offered to the children who came first. Do you regret it? I asked her once. She was quiet for a long time. I regret not being braver, she said. Every single day. That answer cost her something. I could see it plainly. And in its own painful way, it was enough. I told Aaron and Nate about the conversation with Mom. Aaron was quiet when I finished. He stared at the wall and nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something was too large to respond to immediately. Nate's reaction surprised me. He cried. Not dramatically. Quickly, the way adults cry when something they have been holding for too long is finally given a name and a witness. She admitted it, he asked. Yes. She actually said it out loud? She did. He pressed his hands over his face briefly. Then he looked up and said, That's more than I thought we'd ever get. I understood exactly what he meant. They had not been waiting for a perfect apology. Not for Dad to rewrite history or Mom to take back decades of silence. They had simply wanted someone to acknowledge that what happened had been real, that it had mattered, that they had not imagined it and had not deserved it. I had not been able to give them my father's acknowledgement. I was not sure that was coming, but I had given them their mother's. And watching Nate press his hands over his eyes in that small apartment, I understood something I have carried with me since. Sometimes the smallest true thing carries more weight than all the silence that came before it. Sometimes one honest word from the right person is the thing a person has been quietly waiting for their entire life. It has been 2 years since that Sunday afternoon in Nate's apartment. Things are not perfect. The world tells us truth leads to healing and healing leads to happiness, all in a clean, straight line. That is not how it works. It moves in circles. It doubles back. There are weeks when I sit at dinner with my parents and feel something close to normal warmth, and other weeks when I watch my father pour his coffee and feel a quiet anger I do not yet know what to do with. Aaron and my parents are civil now. They text on birthdays. They managed one Christmas dinner together that was strained but not terrible. Small units of progress. Nate has become something I can only describe as intentionally joyful, like a person who decided, firmly and on purpose, to choose the version of life that contains more warmth. He found a partner he loves. He has an apartment he is proud of. He still laughs the way he always laughed, loud and full, but there is something steady underneath it now. A man who knows exactly what he came from and has decided with great care what he is building instead. My father has never directly apologized to either of them. Some wounds run so deep they become part of a person's architecture. You cannot apologize for the structure you became, but you can choose each day to build something different. Whether he will ever make that choice, I genuinely do not know. I am 20 years old now. I am studying in the city, not far from the street where I grew up. Sometimes I walk past our old house on my way to the library. The same narrow building on Clement Street. The same front steps. The same window from which I once watched Aaron carry his life away in boxes. It looks completely ordinary from the outside. Every house does. You cannot tell, just by looking, what kind of life is being lived within its walls. I think about that often. About how many stories are invisible from the street. About how many people carry versions of their childhood that no one else in their family even knows they lived. My childhood was real. The warmth I felt was genuine. The love I received was not a lie. But it was partial, and it was purchased at a price I did not pay myself. And knowing that has changed me, not into someone bitter, not into someone broken, into someone more careful, more awake, more committed to seeing the people in front of me clearly rather than comfortably. The truth does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives on a quiet Sunday afternoon, in a small warm apartment, over cups of tea slowly going cold, in a room full of people who love each other and have been afraid to say so honestly for far too long. I did not lose my family when I finally learned the truth. I met them, all 3 of them, for the very first time,